I get lots of letters from Muslim women who curse me. I cannot explain this reaction of one woman to another by anything other than an expression of jealousy which devours them. When they read my essays, these women ask themselves, both consciously and unconsciously, why can Wafa Sultan exercise her freedom to express her opinions while I cannot? Why can Wafa Sultan live in a country that respects her as a woman while I cannot? When they become frustrated by a lack of answer to their questions, they attack and curse me. I understand and respect their position. Perhaps even better than that, I empathize with them. My heart breaks because I know what a terrible life they lead, but the only thing I can do about it is to write and speak out. Perhaps in a way I can speak out against Islam. I can help them get out of the trap they find themselves in. When discussing the deteriorating position of women in the Muslim world, some defenders of Muslim law protest, claiming that Islam revered women, but that some of its followers had misunderstood the Quran and the prophetic tradition. But I still have a question. Has the same followers misunderstood the Prophet's attitude to women in his lifetime? Where are the Quranic verses or prophetic traditions that can alleviate the ugliness of these attitudes? They are not to be found. How can we view the marriage of a 50-year-old man to a 6-year-old girl, consummated 3 years later, other than as rape? The answer is not to be found. How can we view the marriage of a man to his son's wife as an acceptable act? There is no passage to make one think otherwise. How can we view a man's marriage to his female captive after he attacked her village and killed her husband and father and brother except as a crime? We cannot, because there are no verses or tradition to persuade us otherwise. I really like this next little bit a lot because, well, I think you'll see why. Today, most Muslims attack me unmercifully. They accuse me of picking out from the Quran those verses which serve my purpose, just as I would pick the best cherries out of a box full. This has happened to me multiple times from other Muslims or from people defending Muslims, that I am cherry picking. Naturally, I like this simile and cannot see anything in it that reflects badly on my reliability. The box that God reveals is not supposed to have any spoiled cherries in it. If God does exist, then the most basic moral principle is that this God should be utter perfection. As far as I'm concerned, any impairment of perfection diminishes the authenticity of a God who subjugates women in the ugliest ways possible cannot possibly possess the necessary quality of perfection. If I can pick out spoiled cherries from a box that is supposed to have come down from God, then I have every right to cause you to doubt the authenticity of God. It is difficult, if not impossible, to change one's beliefs about oneself later in life, especially if one continues to live in an environment that helped form those beliefs. I've read a curious experiment conducted by a psychologist who adopted a female chimpanzee from the moment she was born and took her to live at his home with his wife and children as one of the family. The chimpanzee did the same things that the rest of the family did, and everyone treated her as if she was one of them. When she reached maturity, the psychologist gave her a collection of pictures and asked her to classify themselves into two groups, the first of which would contain only a picture of non-humans, such as a book, a cap, a flower, or a bird, while the second would contain pictures of human beings. The pictures the psychologist gave her included one of the chimp herself. The chimpanzee began to sort through the pictures, and she placed the photographs of herself in the group that contained pictures of human beings, for she considered herself human. Why? Because she was treated like human beings since she was born. Women in Muslim countries have fallen into the same trap as that chimpanzee and can no longer perceive themselves other than as society treats them, as inferior to men and lacking men's mental capacity. They have become convinced that they are inferior beings and even begin to defend their classification as such. The Quranic verses and prophetic traditions we've talked about, together with the fatwas interpretations, were enough to distort women's self-image and persuade them that this distorted image was sacred. Islam views women as defective beings, and because of the education they have received, women have become convinced that their defectiveness has indeed sanctified the defectiveness as divine. The problem is no longer simply one of Islamic education. It is being perpetuated by women who defend this education. No situation can be changed unless those living within it are aware of its shortcomings and strive for change. Muslim women live as men's slaves and will remain so until they release themselves from this mistaken conviction. Can you imagine how enslaved a woman must be if she believes this hadith from the Prophet? A man has the right to expect his wife, if his nose runs with blood, mucus, or pus, to lick it up with her tongue. Can you imagine the conceit of a man who believes that his God has entitled him to such a position that his wife must lick up the filth that comes out of his nose? When we broach the subject of head covering, which has kept Muslim women hidden from the entire world and has erected an iron barrier between men and women to live in the same society, these women protest that covering their heads is a decision that they themselves have taken, and the rest of the world has to respect it. It may be their decision, but it's certainly not their choice. It is fear which binds women in Arab countries to these teachings. The Prophet Muhammad told his cousin Ali in an hadith, "On the night the angel took me up into the heavens, I passed by hell and saw women suffering all manners of torture and wept at the sight, so great was their torment. I saw a woman hanging by her hair as her brain boiled. I saw a woman hanging by her breasts, and I saw a woman with the head of a pig and the body of an ass. I saw a woman in the form of a dog with fire going in through her mouth and emerging from her buttocks as angels beat her head with a stick of flame." Could a Hollywood film director specializing in horror films filled with torture imagine a more terrifying scenario as this? How can a Muslim woman refuse to cover her head when she believes that God will hang her by her breast, send fire into her mouth, and bring it out through her backside? She can't, and she won't be able to free herself from her head covering until she frees herself from her fear. Another aspect is, if covering one's head is a matter of personal decision on the part of Muslim women, and the world has to respect this, the question arises, does Islam respect the decision of women who do not cover their heads? Why can Muslim women walk around the streets of Los Angeles wearing a burqa which covers them from head to toe, while Western women visiting Saudi Arabia have to wear a burqa when they go out in public? Is a Muslim woman who refuses to cover her head treated with respect in Muslim society, or does she pay a high price for her decision? When I visited Syria 2 years ago with my American friend Jessica, we sailed to a small island near the Syrian town of Tartus. Together with our guide, a man in his late 20s, we began to explore the island's alleyways, which were crowded with local people and visitors. Jessica remarked, "More women seem to cover their head here on this island than they do in other Syrian towns." I turned to the guide and asked him, "Do all the women here on the island cover their heads?" He answered without hesitation, "Yes, apart from a few prostitutes." His response was nothing more than a reflection of a reality which every woman living in a Muslim society tries to avoid facing. This is one of the most important motives for wearing a hijab. A woman would rather cover her head than be equated with a prostitute. This is about the teachings of the Quran and how it affects Islamic societies. On the economic front, these teachings do not emphasize the importance of work. The concept of work Islam is confined to nomadic migration, raiding, booty, and the struggle for survival. Islam promises its followers rivers, fruit, wine, and milk, but it does not encourage them to sink wells, grow fruit, or raise livestock. Its teachings convince them that life is temporary, it is only valuable if only used to worship God. It deluded them with visions of the hereafter and the gardens of paradise, and they lived on this delusion, waiting for the life to come. They still do. The Quran says, "This is the paradise which the righteous have been promised. There shall flow in the rivers of unpolluted water, and rivers of milk forever fresh, rivers of delectable wine, and rivers of clearest honey. They shall eat therein of every fruit, and receive forgiveness from their Lord. Is this like the lot of those who shall abide in hell forever, and drink scalding water, which will tear their bowels?" Another verse reads, "The life of this world is but a sport and a pastime. Surely better is life to come for those who fear Allah." This means that for Muslims, life in this world have no value. They're only here temporarily, and they have no responsibilities beyond worshiping God so that they can enjoy paradise in the hereafter. The next bit is really good, and it talks about Westerners and how they cannot conceive of how things are in Muslim countries, in the Muslim world, and Islamic teachings, and what the Quran says, because You know, there's all those people that goes, Islam really isn't about that. Those are just extremists. No Westerner can fully comprehend the truth of what I've said here because Westerners do not live in the Muslim world and so find it hard to imagine the extent of the moral disintegration affecting all aspects of life in these societies. People in these societies have lost the ability to feel guilt for their misdeeds. From their earliest youth, they've been brainwashed by teachings that convince them that God has created them to be slaves. As long as he prays, fasts, and reads the Quran, a Muslim feels that he has done his duty, as his sense of responsibility does not extend beyond the performance of those specified commandments. The rulers of all Muslim countries lie to their subjects and plunder and murder and torture them. But on Fridays and religious holidays, they never fail to go to the mosque and pray. No Muslim clergyman will utter a word of criticism of the behavior of these leaders, unless, of course, the leader happens to belong to a different religious denomination. Muslims have been unable to adapt to the world in its new form and have found themselves obliged, both at home and in their own countries and as immigrants abroad, to adopt a new way of life incompatible with their religious laws and beliefs. Both acceptance and rejection of this new order entailed an appalling psychological struggle. On one hand, Western technology has provided Muslims in abundance with a lifestyle they have never dreamed of, and on which they have come to depend. But on the other hand, this new way of life bears no relation and is not compatible whatsoever with the teachings and concepts of religious laws they grew up with. The struggle is most intensively exemplified in Muslims whose fate it is to live outside their homelands. In these people, this conflict has produced a form of depression and unhappiness that one notices immediately in all Muslims living in the West as one gets to know them a little and begins to probe the depths of their psyche. Side note, after she came to the U.S., she went back to school and became a psychologist. This eternal struggle has left these Muslims prey to questions for which they have no answers. They are torn between acceptance and rejection of life among people whom their beliefs do not allow them to trust or to accept as friends or superiors at work. Islam categorically forbids Muslims to accept a job in a workplace where their boss will be a non-Muslim. Life in the West has improved the Muslim standard of living and guaranteed his children a brighter future than their peers in the Muslim world can expect, but at the same time it exposed these children to a way of life that the Muslim religious law finds unacceptable. Muslims differ from the adherents of all the other religions in both the quality and degree of their loyalty to the religion. I have no doubt that some of them have already freed themselves from the bonds imposed by Islam and have begun to enjoy a freer and more open lifestyle either in their homelands or in the countries to which they have immigrated. But no matter how different their individual lifestyles may be, these Muslims are united in their degree of loyalty to their religion. If you strike up a conversation with the most open of them and point out that some of the teachings of Islam contradict the most basic things about the life they are now leading, they will not hesitate for a moment to express the conviction that they themselves are at fault. The error lies, they will say, not with the Muslim teachings, but in their own behavior, which differs so greatly from what the teachings impose. God placed donkeys and mules at Muslims' disposal, while the West gave them mastery over new forms of transportation. But they cannot acknowledge the magnitude of the West's attainments, because they regard them as a challenge to the achievements of God. In their conscious minds, they have chosen the accomplishments of the West, but in their unconscious, it is the God's deeds that take precedence and reign supreme. Muhammad could portray the magnitude of God's power in his followers only by persuading them that they have placed the donkey and mule at their service so that they could ride on them. They thought about this and said to themselves, were it not for the power of God, mules and donkeys would not be able to carry us from place to place, and so they continued to be grateful to God. When the legions of the West stormed the desert with their modern means of transportation, Muslims left their donkeys and mules to the mercies of the wilderness and accepted the gifts the West had to offer, with satisfaction, though never with gratitude. The concepts of winning and losing have different meanings in Muslim cultural lexicon than they do in the West. From our earliest youth, we are taught that when someone else wins, we lose, and that we win when others lose. My mother was less concerned with my getting a perfect score in all my subjects at school than she was with what the grade the neighbor's daughter had gotten. We are not capable of building a spaceship, but I can still recall how we danced and shouted for joy when the American space shuttle Challenger disintegrated, killing its entire crew. The tsunami killed hundreds of thousands of people, most of whom were Muslims. Yet some Muslim clergymen told us that the disaster was God's way of punishing the unbelievers who filled the Indonesian nightclubs with prostitutes and began to spread stories of a mosque that has remained standing, unaffected by the storm. The deaths of hundreds of thousands of people is no loss, so long as we have gained a mosque. That thought is carried over not just by Muslims. You, like, say, with the whole cross thing, the World Trade Center cross, Christian, ignore all the thousands of people who have died. There is a cross beam that remained semi-upright. The tornadoes out in the west earlier in the spring, whole towns ruined, but a church remaining. Praise God. Islam is not just a religion. It is a political doctrine that imposes itself by force, and we have to subject to microscopic scrutiny any Muslim in America who ascends to the heights of an important government post. I do not want anyone to regard what I'm saying as anti-Muslim prejudice. Muslims, like any other national group, can be either good or bad, and the best among them do not act in accordance with the teachings of the religion, either because they're not familiar with them or because they have deliberately progressed beyond them. But to understand what it would mean for a Muslim to become president of the United States, one must search through Islamic history, the history of the Arabs, which is my own history for a Muslim leader, and look at his actions. Once Americans understand that the Quran insists that Muhammad is the ideal that every Muslim male should imitate, they will realize that a Muslim candidate for the American presidency is a very serious matter. America will never win the war until Americans read about Islam from Arab sources word for word without distortion or falsification. Reading this material will enable them to draw their own personal conclusions and help them to understand what kind of enemy they are facing. No one can be a true Muslim and a true American simultaneously. Islam is both a religion and a state, and to be a true Muslim, you must believe in Islam as both religion and state. A true Muslim does not acknowledge the U.S. Constitution, and his willingness to live under that Constitution is, as far as he is concerned, nothing more than an avoidable step on the way to the Constitution's replacement by Islamic Sharia law. The Quran says, "Believers, take neither Jews nor Christians as your friends. They are friends with one another. Whoever of you seeks their friendship shall become one of their number. Allah does not guide the wrongdoers." Would a Muslim candidate for the American presidency be able to put his trust in Jews and Christians if he believes that they are not fit to be his friends and protectors? Those are some excerpts from A God Who Hates by Wafa Sultan, and I highly recommend it. It is much more enjoyable to read, I am sure, than to listen to me stumble over words. I think it is an important read, even if you are a Muslim or a defender of the religion. It will give you something to think about at the very least.